Number 1.
So this is an experience from a few years back. I was in high school at the time, and my mother had just died tragically and unexpectedly in a car accident. In order to try and cope with our loss, my father and I took a trip down to the Cooper River in Alaska with our friends Brian and Robert. We drove down expecting to go dip netting, which is essentially fishing with a net on a pole. Once we reached Cooper River, we chose to take the less traveled and more private side to set up camp. After settling far down the path, we all set up our tents and got ready to go dip netting. After a long day, we called it a night and rode our four-wheelers back to our designated spot. There were no other occupied camping spots that we had noticed, all of them simply being small clearings that barely cut into the dense woods that surrounded the river. You could maybe see 20 feet into the trees before it gave way to darkness. We all reached our camp and began to settle down, discussing our bad luck with fishing. We all had just begun to cook some hot dogs over the fire when we heard a gunshot from down the path. As I said before, we had seen no tents between where we had been fishing and where we were camping. We thought we were completely alone. Our campsite faced the river with a trail in between, and to the left was the way back to civilization. The right just led to more wilderness. The gunshot had come from the right of us. All four of us sat up and Brian suggested that we should go check it out. We didn't take our four-wheelers. We simply hiked down the trail on foot. Brian and Robert both led with their guns, and my father and I followed behind. I know it sounds like we kind of went looking for trouble, but trust me, you don't want to be asleep with people shooting guns around the Alaskan wilderness, or anywhere for that matter. After traveling down the trail for what felt like an hour without seeing anyone, we reached a stone tunnel that covered the path. We hunched down on our side, and we could make out multiple figures on the other end of the tunnel, and they were all moving. They seemed to be dancing next to a fire, waving objects around in the air. Brian suggested that they were just a group of rowdy college kids who must have been drinking pretty heavily and fired off some guns, and it seemed like to the rest of us the logical assumption. We all decided that instead of approaching them, we would just move our camp further away from them and not take any risks. As we headed back along the trail, 2 trucks full of more rowdy teens passed by us, traveling much faster than was necessary or wise, and the 4 of us had to nearly dive out of the way to prevent from getting struck. When we get there, we see our tents torn down and our fire put out. Our four-wheelers had been knocked over, and just overall ruination of the entire campsite. Written in the dirt over by the fire were the words, "See you soon." We decided to hightail it out of there immediately. There was only one trail out, and we definitely didn't want to be left in a position where we were trapped between the people who threatened us and the exit. We gathered everything as quickly as we could, packing the torn tents and attaching the coolers to the back of the four-wheelers. Then we headed out. In retrospect, we may have been acting paranoid. There were 3 adults in our party after all, 2 of them armed with guns. Had some rowdy drunken college kids returned, we would have been able to defend ourselves. But we knew that they definitely had at least 1 gun as well, and my father did not want to risk my well-being, especially while the loss of my mother was so fresh. On the other hand, we don't know for sure if it was rowdy teens that destroyed our camp. Maybe there had been someone else up there, watching from the shadows, and maybe we were lucky we got out before they came back.
Number 2.
I think this story will be improved by some context about the setting and such. So here we go. First, this story took place after I graduated high school and moved away from my family. I moved up to Alaska again. I say again, because I lived there once before and attended college there. Second, and very conveniently, my mother had been renting out our old house instead of selling it. I say conveniently because the long-standing residents had moved away, and therefore I was awarded the old house. I had to work quite a bit to keep up the payments, but my mother pitched in, thankfully. Third, at the beginning of this story, I should make you aware that I had recently broken up with a girl who had been staying with me in the old house I was renting through my mother, and this breakup was unclean and dysfunctional, much like the relationship itself was. And so finally, the story begins. It was winter break, which means I would be spending more time inside than I normally would. It was somewhat lonely in the house, being without a stable girlfriend then. Also, there was no neighbors really to speak of, as the house was in an extremely wooded region a few miles out of town. One late afternoon, soon after I thought the whole breakup predicament had come to a close, I was made quite aware that it wasn't. My cell phone began ringing, and I saw that it was from an unknown number. Cliché, I know, and I decided to pick it up. It was, of course, my ex. She began telling me about how great her new boyfriend is, and how horrible I was and am. The sort of talk you can smell the booze off the caller's breath from miles away. I actually listened until she decided to hand the phone over to her boyfriend, where he was instead sounding oddly threatening, and I decided to hang up in the most polite manner possible with a "fuck you, have a nice day." Days later, again with my mind beginning to forget, only this time about the most certainly drunken phone call, I'm lying in the living room couch watching some TV. While lying there, I noticed something quite unsettling. A person standing in the window behind me. You may ask, how did I notice this? The reflection from the TV screen is how. I didn't move an inch. I had no gun, no knife. I had nothing but my wit and my fists. I just lie there, watching the reflection. Eventually it moved away from the window. That normally wouldn't spook me, but I was taking into account that 1. The house was nowhere near another, so that's a red flag. 2. If someone was just wanting to talk, they would knock. And 3. I was almost certain it was that boyfriend of hers. Nothing became of that situation, but similar situations continued, such as a car pulling into the driveway and no one getting out, then leaving inconspicuously. This was worrisome at the least, but I didn't suspect a true threat. A few days later, I'm lying in bed. It was very late and I was getting ready to sleep. I get another call from an unknown number. It was her again, but this time she was asking me to come outside because she wanted to give me an apology. At the time I was thinking, oh, shall we say, fuck off. Though I still went outside to see what the deal was. I open the door and of course, it's incredibly dark. I say into the phone, I'm outside. Come around back. With this, I began to walk on the snow-covered ground in the darkness with my just put on boots. The motion light turns on as I cross the garage and driveway. The snow masking the ground is tinted yellow by the light. I round the corner of the garage and turn my phone to see. There's a road that runs behind my house and connects to the driveway by bending, and I make my way towards the road. The snow crunches beneath my boots as I make my way closer. There's a part in the trees that allows me to walk straight to the road. Otherwise, no one could make their way around the entirety of the driveway. I reach this part. I ask into the phone, where are you? I'm in the car. I see you. I step onto the road, and I see her parked car a few dozen feet away from me, with the lights dimmed. So what's the deal? I just want to talk. Come here. I approach the car and I make my way around to the passenger side, and I finally see her face. She waves me in, and I oblige. I get in the car and sit down. I look at her and she says, look, I'm sorry, I know I've been a real bitch lately. No, it's okay. I wasn't really good to you and I deserve it. I don't agree, but... She abruptly stopped speaking because a pair of car lights shined from behind us. Naturally, I assume it's her boyfriend. And by the look in her face, she did too. The car parks behind us and sure enough, the boyfriend gets out and storms over to my side of the car. He yanks on the door handle and the door swings open. He attempts to grab me, but I grab his wrist and get out of the car.
What the fuck do you think you're doing with her, huh?
We're just talking, and I was about to leave.
Bullshit. You're trying to fuck her, aren't you?
Look, I'm trying to sleep. I'm in no mood to do anything. He gave me this look of utter enragement before swinging at me, and of course missing. A little scuffle ensued, and all that happened was him swearing and eventually slipping and falling, before yelling at us both.
"I'll fucking kill you!"
I just stood by her car as he pulled away. She gave me a lift back to the house and I invited her inside, and she obliged. It was late in the night, and I suggested that she lock her car if she was going to stay the night. We slept upstairs in my bed before I awoke hours later. There was a banging at the back door, and I knew this because the back door was directly below my room. She woke up too and said, "Oh my God." I stood up quickly and got to my closet and reached behind the coats that I never wear, and I grabbed my Louisville Slugger. She was sitting upright in my bed with her hands covering her eyes. I didn't say anything before walking down the stairs slowly, attempting to be silent. The lights were off and there were no windows on the staircase, and the pounding on the back door had audibly ceased. I held the bat tightly, making sure it didn't bang into the wall to signal my position at the time. I remember how slowly I stepped down, especially on the bottom 3 steps, which were always the creakiest. Once I reached the final step, I froze, and it still gives me chills to this day. The hardwood floors creak around the bottom of the staircase, and there was a creaking that was growing closer and closer. I raised the bat above my head, ready to slam whoever it was right on top of the head. The creaking grew closer until I could hear it from my side, and I planned to swing as soon as it was in front of me. As the staircase opened to the left from the bottom coming up, I listened ever so carefully, holding my breath. The creaking came to my northeast, and I squeezed my hands tighter than I ever had before around the bat, waiting for it to come just north of me. There was more creaking sounds. This time, they were directly in front of me, and I slammed the bat down hard, and it hit something, and whatever it was crumpled to the floor with a bang and a small flash. I turned on the light, and there he was, the boyfriend. He had shot his gun directly at the floor and left a hole in the hard wood. My ex came down the stairs crying profusely, muttering, "I'm so sorry," over and over again. I called the police, and 4 cops pulled into my driveway along with an ambulance in a matter of minutes. I sat at the base of the stairs, watching the boyfriend. He was breathing. I could tell from his chest slowly inclining and declining off the floor. I grabbed what I thought was a 9mm off the floor and kept it in my hand with the safety turned on. I just shook my head over and over in utter disbelief. I explained the situation to the police as the paramedics rushed in and carried him out on a stretcher. All in all, I didn't get to sleep until late in the afternoon, after everything was done and over with. He ended up actually being induced into a coma, but eventually recovered, and a restraining order had already been filed in advance. My ex and I became good friends after the incident, and she never dated that guy again. I never ended up moving out though. I had considered it, but nothing like that has happened since, and there you have it.
Number 3.
This story is told from the point of view of a female. First off, for those who don't know, Robert Hansen was an American serial killer known as the Butcher Baker, who killed at least 17 women in Alaska between 1971 and 1983. I knew him during that time. I was in my late teens. I first became acquainted with Robert in the late 70s. My grandmother lived in an apartment on 9th and Ingra in Anchorage next door to his bakery. I would go see my grandma pretty often as a child. She always was happy for company because she had a hard time getting around and wasn't in the best health. A lot of times my brother and cousins would come and visit her. My grandma would often give me money to go next door to the bakery to get a dozen donuts from Robert while she made the strongest coffee in the world. Robert would always be there and would ask how my grandmother was doing, and would get some dinner rolls out of the oven and proceed to wrap them up for me at no charge, and would ask me to tell my grandmother he said hi. I thought he was one of the absolute nicest people I've ever met, and I knew he kind of liked me, but I figured he was a harmless nerdy guy who had an eye for the ladies. I remember he had a severe acne problem, but to be fair, standing over a vat of hot grease frying donuts doesn't exactly help the complexion. He He and I had something in common, because I worked at a donut shop as well a few blocks away. I worked graveyard shift after originally working the day shift. I switched because the pay was higher if you worked nights. I was trying to graduate high school and help pay rent at the same time. I didn't mind. At the time, I was young and energetic. One day I got this great notion that since Robert always liked me so much, I thought I would ask him for a job at his bakery. I figured since I had the experience as a donut fryer that maybe I could get a higher wage from him. Plus his shop was way more well known and successful. I asked him one day while visiting my grandmother, and he kind of sheepishly avoided directly answering me, instead vaguely promising that he would consider hiring me if his current donut fryer ever quit. And it wasn't until afterwards that it occurred to me that he had an all-male staff. In late October of '83, I remember hearing the police raided his home and found evidence that linked him to several bodies that had been found buried in shallow graves in the Alaskan wilderness. He was eventually arrested. It came to light that he would kidnap young women, fly them out to the wilderness, and hunt them down for sport in cold blood. Some of the women he brought home and chained in his basement to have his way with them when his family wasn't home. His wife and children had no clue. I never thought that such a nice guy who treated my family with such respect and generosity would turn out to be such a monster. Sometimes I wonder why he never targeted me, or at least never followed through with a potential plan to take me. One time he even picked me up while I was hitchhiking, and we were alone together. It turns out you can never really know who a person is based on how they behave. It took me a long time afterwards to trust anybody. I really did think of him as a friend, and would have never thought he was even capable of harming a fly. There was never any hint of a dark temper from him, or that gut feeling that comes when you get a creeper vibe. I'm kind of glad that my grandmother died before the truth came to light. Hansen eventually admitted to several of the murders after he was imprisoned, but based on what I've read, he never showed any remorse, always blaming the women he kidnapped for his actions. I feel extremely grateful for whatever reason he never chose me as his victim, and that he was caught before he could change his mind.
There's always a reason to be afraid.